I never expected the silence to weigh more than the truth. It started with a photo sent from someone who once served under me in Kun Ah. No caption, just the image. A long table dressed in cream linen silverware glinting under late afternoon sun. My father at the center lifting a glass of rye with the ease of ritual. Grayson stood beside him, chin lifted just enough to suggest humility rehearsed. My mother poised at the end, fingers resting lightly on the stem of a wineglass she rarely finished. Behind them hung a banner I hadn't seen in years. 150 years of Whitmore honor. I stared at the words until the screen dimmed. Then I tapped it back to life as if the extra second would change what I saw. They didn't invite me. Not even a message. Not even a lie about timing. Just absence clean precise, like I had been edited out instead of excluded. I zoomed in. The chair to the left of my father had always been mine. Now it belonged to Preston McAllister. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, same smug half-smile I remembered from his West Point commissioning ceremony, the one where he gave a speech lifted from my after-action report down to the phrasing. My father held his glass high in that photo, frozen mid-sentence. The article beneath it quoted him exactly. We're proud of those who carry the family's values with grace and consistency. And as for those who've chosen other paths, well, they carry what comes with that. No names. None needed. The coffee on my desk had gone cold. A ring stained the memo I hadn't signed. I stared at it for a moment longer, then folded the page over and pressed my palm to the crease as if that act might flatten the ache building in the space between my ribs. They had celebrated lineage without me. My inbox pinged. Another reminder for the logistics call at 1500. I closed the laptop, slipped the key card into my jacket pocket, untied my bun, and let the hair fall the way I used to before inspection. Nothing ceremonial about it. Just the end of one shape. On my way out, I passed a junior officer, eyes wide as if unsure whether to salute. I didn't slow. In the elevator, the mirrored walls didn't offer comfort or judgment, just reflection. My collar was still crisp. The bar pins gleamed, a row of medals earned without camera crews or family applause. I remembered polishing them alone in the barracks, long before any press release would care. The drive home was uneventful, but I kept thinking about the banner, not because I missed the idea of being included, but because they kept using words like honor and family as if they still meant the same thing. At a red light, I read the article again. Captain Grayson Whitmore represents what this lineage was built on: leadership, loyalty, legacy. Legacy. It always came back to that, a word my father loved more than people. More than truth. The first time he told me it wasn't about blood, but about reflection. I was 13, still in track cleats, breathless after my first win. He stood by the fence, arms crossed, and said, "Your brother would have paced better. You pushed too hard in the middle." I nodded, said nothing. I'd said nothing for years. In the kitchen, I set down the phone and opened the drawer beneath the sink. The envelope was still there, thick navy paper with gold embossing. My own commissioning invitation. Unsent. Unopened. I had meant to give it to them once, then thought better of it. Outside, wind bent the maple branches toward the window, like hands searching for entry. I didn't let them in. At the far end of the room, next to the bookshelf, hung a photograph I never framed, a candid shot from Bagram dusty and blurred. I stood beside Sergeant Boone Helmet, tucked under one arm, blood-stained but smiling. No one back home had ever asked where it was taken. I ran my finger along the edge of the frame. The glass was cracked from a move 2 apartments ago. I hadn't fixed it. There's something honest about leaving things as they break. The kettle clicked behind me. I didn't turn it off. Instead, I picked up the article again, rereading the final line. Legacy, said Franklin Whitmore, is what survives you, what others carry forward once you're gone. He was right. They were carrying something. But it wasn't mine. The silence that followed wasn't hollow. It was full dense with all the words I would never be invited to say. I folded the photo into the envelope meant for my invitation and sealed it. Not to send, just to keep the fiction together in one place. Then, I sat at the table, tea cooling untouched beside me, and let the weight of being forgotten land fully where it always had between memory and mercy. Not everything that's heavy needs to be lifted. Some things are meant to be set down and left. Some people learn the shape of their silence by the echo it never makes. I used to count my efforts like medals, neatly, as if order could make them count for more, as if trying hard enough might someday sound like belonging. The first time I brought home something I thought mattered, I still had blisters on my heels. I'd run the last stretch of the state finals, with one shoe half-loose tape peeling from my ankle. I won by less than a second. I held the ribbon out to my father across the front porch, trying not to wince, as my sock bled through. He didn't take it. Grayson just got into the honors science program, he said. That's the kind of thing colleges notice. I left the ribbon in the kitchen drawer next to the twist ties and spare batteries. It stayed there until someone threw it out during a pantry remodel. At Fort Bragg, I wrote letters in pencil because the pen ink smudged under the humidity. I mailed photos of the obstacle course of my hands, wrapped in tape and resin. I drew a small asterisk on the back of one first time over the wall in under 40. Weeks passed. Nothing came back. Then a voicemail blinked into my inbox. "It'd help if you wired that transfer by Monday," my mother's voice said. "We're trying to fix the roof before the storms roll in. No mention of the photos. Or the wall." I complied. I always did back then. On time. No questions, even when I didn't know what was being fixed anymore. After Afghanistan, I received a small bonus. Hazard pay. I sent it home with a note clipped to the check. "Maybe use this for the new siding I wrote. It should be enough for cedar, not vinyl." They didn't reply. But a month later, a photo appeared on Grayson's social media. Him grinning by a new stainless steel dishwasher, the caption reading, "Some of us remember where we come from." The picture had 15 likes from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. My name wasn't tagged. My note, I assume, ended up in the trash. There was no blow-up, no slammed doors, just the kind of erosion that doesn't need wind, just time. Still, I tried. I flew home once on a 72-hour pass and brought a handmade loaf of sourdough from a local bakery downtown. I set it on the counter with a note for dinner, fig and walnut, Dad's favorite. By dinner time, it had been moved to the trash under a wet tea bag. My mother served store-bought rolls. She didn't mention the bread. She didn't see the note. I told myself they were busy, distracted, focused on things that mattered more, things I hadn't become. In my field journal, somewhere between threat assessments and tactical overlays, I folded a letter from a sergeant I barely knew. He had taken shrapnel near Marjar, and I had dragged him back under cover with my left arm dislocated. His handwriting slanted hard left. The paper had blood at the edge. "You didn't leave me. That's enough for me." I never replied. I didn't know what to say to someone who saw me when I still couldn't see myself. I kept that letter between pages I no longer needed, strategy diagrams, heat signatures, notes on supply route disruption. It lived there like a kind of proof, not of heroism, just of presence. I returned once briefly for Grayson's promotion ceremony. I wore the same dress uniform I'd worn to bury 3 of my men. It felt tighter, then heavier. My mother gestured toward me during a conversation with a cousin and said, "Well, she's still in uniform, but I don't think it's her final path." Grayson, though, he was born to lead. I excused myself to the restroom and didn't come back until the room quieted. No one noticed. At some point, the trying stopped being about reconciliation. It became something quieter, a kind of routine performance I thought might keep me from disappearing entirely. But disappearing happens in degrees. It's in how your name doesn't make the Christmas cards anymore. It's in how your presence at weddings becomes optional, and then awkward, and then no longer addressed. It's in how your own mother asks, "Do you really think it's healthy to keep going back to all that military stuff? Maybe take a break. Let Grayson handle the speech this year, even when the speech was yours." I once found a box labeled extra linens in the attic. Inside, beneath mismatched pillowcases, was a photo of me in airborne school, face caked in mud, smile still uneven from a broken molar. The frame was cracked, the glass gone. I didn't ask about it. I just wrapped it in an old scarf and put it in the bottom drawer of my apartment nightstand. No one ever noticed it missing. Some nights I sat at the desk with that drawer slightly ajar, the edge of the photo just visible. I didn't light candles or play music. I didn't even touch the frame. Just left it there, visible enough to know it was real. Effort, I've learned, only matters when it meets a door that opens back. And theirs never did. Some absences don't come from forgetting. They come from never looking in the first place. The envelope arrived with no return address. Just my name scribbled in block letters, no salutation. Inside was a faded party invitation. White cardstock, gold trim, embossed balloons. Grayson's 30th, come celebrate a true Whitmore. It had already passed. The postmark read 7 days ago. Someone mailed it late or on purpose. Maybe they didn't. Maybe it sat on a counter next to keys and bills and the soft assumption that I wouldn't come anyway. I left it unopened on the windowsill. The sun curled its corners by morning. At the Pentagon ceremony, I stood still while the general pinned the ribbon. My hands remained at my sides. Someone took a photo. There was applause. My phone vibrated twice in my coat pocket. Later, I checked the message. "Don't forget the transfer this week, sweetheart." Fridges on its last legs. No mention of the ceremony. No acknowledgement of the photo I'd sent a week before, standing in the press brief, hair tucked neat ribbons still sharp against the uniform. The next day, I saw a tagged post Grayson at the family lake house, holding up a paddleboard with a caption, "Still standing tall, even on water." My ribbon wasn't visible in the photo I was in. His smile had better lighting. That Thanksgiving I brought a pie. My own crust, not store-bought. Baked at sunrise, wrapped in clean linen. I set it on the table without comment. Later, I watched my mother pass it without pause. "Who brought this one?" Her voice didn't rise. "Probably Grayson," someone mumbled. She nodded. He always did have a sweet tooth. I didn't correct her. The fork in my hand stayed clean. I watched the crust crumble beneath someone else's knife and let it happen. On deployment, I'd taken shrapnel just below the collarbone. Minor. Clean exit! The radio was damaged, so I used my sat phone on the hilltop. 45 seconds. That was the length of the call. "You should have seen Fred's eye," my mother's voice said. all red like a peeled grape. "We've been going over to help. It's been a lot." I waited. No question followed. The line went quiet, then clicked. I didn't call again until after recovery. A year later, I found a photo stuck to the back of a family calendar, an old one, the kind they sent Balchon with pre-printed holidays and local farmers' ads along the bottom. In the center square of July was a picture of Grayson next to a banner that read, "Proud to be a Whitmore." He stood at attention, hand on his chest, a child beside him mimicking the pose. My name was printed nowhere. My service wasn't listed in the notable dates. I closed the calendar and slid it under a pile of old magazines. The paper was already yellowing. Sometimes things don't get erased. They just never get written. When I cleaned out my footlocker, I found a folder labeled MISC, Commendations. It held certificates I'd forgotten, leadership citations, tactical innovation memos, a commander's note scribbled in the margin of a typed report. She sees 5 moves ahead. Someone listened to her. I'd once shown it to my father. He read it quickly, then said Grayson's been invited to keynote the Veterans Gala this year. Public speaking was never your strength anyway. I nodded, folded the paper again along the old crease. That winter I sent them a holiday card. Just a small photo of me standing beside the team in snow camouflage gear. Our tent half buried behind us, the caption in pen still here. There was no reply, no call. Nothing returned. On New Year's Eve, I opened my inbox and found an evite to a Whitmore family slideshow night. The description read, "Honoring a year of success leadership and growth." Grayson's journey in photos. There was a section at the bottom to RSVP contact Margaret or Preston. I stared at the screen long enough for the edges to blur. Then I archived it. No folder, just gone. Sometimes I wondered what they'd say if asked directly. Would they admit it? Would they say, "She chose her path. We chose ours." Or, "Grayson represents us." She complicates things. I never tested it. Some questions come with answers that weigh more than silence. In the back of my desk drawer, under a dried pen and a chipped pin I never wore, there's a navy folder marked in fading ink to Captain Whitmore. The edges are creased, the seal long broken. Inside is the Soldier of the Year certificate. No frame, no display. Just paper bent at the top, folded once by accident, and never smoothed again. I lifted it out, held it to the light. The ink has dulled. The emblem at the top is still bold. I didn't reread the citation. I didn't clean the smudge near the corner. I just put it back. Carefully. Slowly. Then closed the drawer with 2 fingers and let the sound settle into the quiet. Some honors aren't meant to be displayed. Some names were never meant to be remembered in rooms that forgot you before you even walked in. I used to think the worst thing someone could take from me was credit. But it isn't. It's the quiet certainty that they never saw me standing there to begin with. The interview aired mid-morning. I hadn't meant to watch it. The television in the corner of the briefing room had been cycling through headlines half-muted, while I finished reviewing logistics reports. Then a voice I knew too well pushed through the static. "Preston!" Hair parted sharp, a muted grey tie, hands clasped just tight enough to suggest gravity. The lower third read, "Lieutenant Preston McAllister, architect of Iron Echo." I didn't move, not even when the anchor leaned in and asked about the turning point of the mission. We were pinned near the southern ridge, Preston said, his voice measured. Air cover was too far out. I gave the fallback order and rerouted 2 flanks behind the eastern elevation. He paused. That maneuver turned the tide. He looked so composed, so practiced. I could still hear my own voice calling that order across a dust-clogged comms line. The headset was slipping. Blood on my glove made it hard to grip the push to talk. The elevation gain cost us 13 minutes, but it worked. Every word he said came from a report I wrote. Verbatim. Not just the strategy, the phrasing, the tempo. He never mentioned my name. The camera cut to footage blurry clips of soldiers crouched in mud artillery flashes lighting up behind them. None of it showed who was actually there. And that, I realize, was the point. The screen froze as the segment ended. Preston smiled faintly, just long enough to be humble. I turned away. A minute later, a notification popped up on my desktop. Classified dispatch. Priority internal. I opened the document. Short. Precise. Effective. Immediately you are placed on administrative suspension, pending formal investigation under UCMJ, Title 10, Article 92, Mishandling of Secure Operational Data. It was signed electronically. General Vernon Slater. He hadn't spoken to me in over a year, not since I flagged a discrepancy in his drone report that cost him a defense contract. I reread the memo once, then closed the tab. On my desk sat a black pen, the kind I used for final sign-offs. I clicked it once, then again. I didn't write anything. I opened the top drawer, took out my badge, my challenge coin, the metal nameplate I'd had since my first command. I lined them up one by one like field markers, then I slid them into the envelope the memo came in. No ceremony, just a kind of methodical stillness I'd learned from years of watching things break quietly. As I was leaving, a lieutenant in the hallway gave me a slight nod. Not a salute, just recognition, maybe habit. Outside the building, the wind moved without sound. The sky was too blue for what had just been taken. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Saw the interview my father's message read. Preston looked strong. That's the kind of presence we need out front. Then another line. You were always better behind the curtain. Spotlight doesn't suit everyone. There was no question in it. No pause to consider how it might feel to see a cousin presented to the world in the exact words you once spoke under fire. I didn't answer. I powered the phone down. That evening, I opened the storage trunk I kept under my bed. Inside, folded in the lining of an old flight jacket, was a hard copy of the Iron Echo mission brief, signed, dated, encrypted. My initials were on every page. I pressed my thumb to the corner of the folder where the laminate was starting to peel. I hadn't pulled it out in months. I didn't need it to remember. Still, I flipped to page 14, the fallback order, the ridge maneuver, the timestamp scrawled by hand after the op concluded. The margin read, initiated by CW executed under duress, verified at 0407. It wasn't dramatic. It was just real. A truth buried beneath headlines and bright studio lights. Later that night, I stood in front of the kitchen sink, letting water run over a coffee mug I never used. It had a small chip at the lip, a souvenir from some base camp in Kandahar. I couldn't remember which. I set the mug down, still dripping, and wiped my hands on the hem of an old shirt. One of the sleeves was frayed where it had caught on concertina wire years ago. I should have thrown it out, but something about its wear made it honest. When I sat down, the lights were still on. The room held that kind of quiet that didn't ask for music. I opened my laptop. The last file I'd ever touched in my official capacity blinked in the corner. Iron Echo Final Cleared Teep. I didn't delete it. I didn't drag it into a folder. I just closed the screen. They hadn't destroyed my work. They'd simply redrafted the story until my name no longer fit the arc. And the cleaner version they built was easier to market, easier to praise, easier to protect, easier to believe. I didn't lose my place. They just invented someone simpler to stand in it. Some endings don't echo. They just settle quiet and absolute like a stone sinking through still water. I didn't pack everything. Only what I could carry without resentment. The rest awards with dusty edges, framed citations with misspelled ranks, trinkets from missions nobody else remembered stayed behind in drawers that no one would open. The duffel bag held 4 things: the bandana from Kandahar, still faintly stiff from salt, the silver badge I used to clip to my belt without thought, the old field notebook with bent wire coils and a fading phrase on the cover, and the envelope Colleen had handed me, its flap unsealed its truth, folded flat. The hallway outside my office was quieter than usual, as if the building itself understood what was happening and didn't want to interfere. I walked past 3 closed-doors offices where I used to brief, debrief, advise, recalibrate. Nobody opened them. Lieutenant Cardenas passed me near the exit. He glanced up, then quickly down again. "They'll say you overreacted," he murmured. I stopped. Not for long, just long enough to look at him without speaking. He swallowed. "But we know. I didn't need agreement. Or vindication. Only gravity." I nodded once, the kind you give when something has landed and will not be moved. The lobby looked the same. Flags in formation. Carpet that muffled every step. The air always a few degrees colder than comfort. At the far end past security, sunlight spilled through glass that never quite let you see clearly. I had walked this path hundreds of times, but never like this. Never with my hands empty. Colleen waited at the bottom of the steps, leaning against a pillar, a manila folder tucked beneath her arm. She didn't wave. When I reached her, she extended it without flourish. Time-stamped radio logs. Your voice on every call. I highlighted the parts Preston copied word for word. The paper felt heavier than its weight. I slipped it into the duffel without looking. "You're not even going to file a formal response." "They don't want facts," I said. "They want neat endings." She squinted into the sunlight. "He'll crash it." "You know that, right? He was never meant to steer it. He was meant to stand in front of it." I started to turn, but she reached out, brief, like catching a thread, before it blows away. "I would have stayed. If you'd said something." I didn't pull back, but I didn't hold on either. "I know," I said, not as accusation, just a fact, just a line drawn in dry sand, the key card in my coat pocket pressed against my hip. I took it out and placed it on the stone ledge beside the stairs. No ceremony, no lingering. Inside the lobby, nobody turned around. I walked to the parking garage. The same concrete shadows, the same flickering lights. My car looked smaller than I remembered. I opened the door and placed the bag on the passenger seat, buckling it as if to keep something from falling apart. I sat for a moment before starting the engine. The silence inside the car wasn't oppressive. It just was. The notebook slid slightly on the dashboard as I turned the key. The phrase on its cover had almost vanished. Just the faintest imprint left behind. "Make it mean something." I didn't open it. Not then. I pulled out of the garage. Nobody followed. Halfway down Route 50, the city blurred behind me, not in speed, but in certainty. I didn't know where I was going, only that I wouldn't be circling back. The glove compartment held a single spare ID badge. I placed it in the same envelope Colleen had given me and sealed it with the edge of my thumb. At the next rest stop, I dropped it into a mailbox without writing an address. No note inside. No initials. No proof of delivery. Back in the car, I looked at the rear-view mirror. The faint outline of the Pentagon still lingered in the corner of the reflection like a watermark. My reflection didn't flinch. No calls came in, no new emails. Just the same unopened text from my father from a week before. We're disappointed, but not surprised. I hadn't replied then. I wouldn't now. There are things too weighted for response. At dusk, I pulled over by a narrow overlook. The air smelled like dry bark and old stone. I got out, opened the trunk, and took nothing with me. I stood there for a long while, hands in my pockets, the envelope pressing against my thigh like a silent verdict. A hawk passed overhead. No symbolism, just wind and wings and a quiet line across the sky. I returned to the car, closed the door gently, and turned the engine off. Then I sat still. No music, no words, no explanation scribbled in a corner of my mind. Just breath, just space. And the sound of one thing, ending without apology, without appeal. I stopped checking the time. The watch I'd worn through 2 deployments lay face down on the windowsill, its band curled in on itself like it was trying to remember a wrist. I didn't wind it. I didn't touch it. It had served its purpose, punctuality, precision, accountability. None of those held sway here. The cabin leaned westward. I noticed it each time I boiled water on the stove, the way the kettle tilted slightly before the whistle. It didn't bother me. Things that didn't pretend to be perfect had started to feel honest. I washed dishes by hand, letting the water pool in the chipped sink. There was no hot water, unless I lit the pilot myself, and most days I didn't bother. Cold water reminded me I was still here. I drank coffee black. The sugar jar sat full beside the matches untouched. I didn't forget. I just didn't reach for it. The silence came on gradually. Not all at once like the silence of a slammed door, but like a tide retreating. No more alerts. No inbox. No pre-dawn meeting requests. Just the low creak of the floor and the occasional shuffle of something small in the walls, probably a squirrel. On the 5th day, opened my notebook. The first page had a crease in it right down the center, as if someone had tried to fold the whole day in half. I wrote one sentence, "They don't get to define me anymore." Then I closed it again and slid it under the mattress. That felt like enough. Once I dropped a fork and caught myself standing at attention before picking it up. Old reflex. I didn't correct it. I just picked up the fork and put it in the sink. I left my boots by the door. Not because I expected visitors, but because the habit of removing them felt like a small act of respect towards something, if not someone. When the knock came, I knew it was Wes before I opened the door. Not because he'd warned me, but because there was no hesitation in the sound. 3 sharp raps evenly spaced, like code. He held up a USB drive, no greeting. I followed the traffic pattern. The emails came from Grayson's office, routed to Preston. Duplicates match your field comms from Iron Echo. I didn't reach for it. I looked at the object, then at his face. I stepped back without inviting him in. Not yet. He nodded once and didn't argue, just tucked the drive back into his jacket. I'll keep looking. That was the end of the visit. No questions, no advice, just data offered and refused. I swept the porch that night with an old broom I found in the shed. The bristles were bent and each stroke left more dust than it cleared. Still, I finished the job. It felt necessary. There was a stack of mail I hadn't opened, some bills, a catalogue, one postcard with a watercolour of Jefferson Rock and no signature. I left them on the counter in a neat pile, untouched. The jacket I wore each day still carried the faint outline of my rank on the shoulder. I hadn't pulled the patch off. I hadn't decided if I would. I remembered my mother's voice the day I left for basic. Just don't come back with too many opinions. She hadn't meant it as a warning. She meant it as a rule. I found a pair of gloves in the back of the truck, still caked with sand from the last training site. I should have tossed them. I didn't. The phone stayed plugged in but face down. 2 bars on the good days. One night it buzzed a message from Colleen Safe. That was it. No punctuation, no demand. I didn't reply. Instead, I stared at the message until the screen went dark. I cooked pasta in the same pot each night. I didn't mind the repetition. I liked knowing what would happen next, even if it was just garlic browning in oil. I took out the leather folder from my duffel once. Inside, discharge paperwork photos, the citation I never collected. I touched each page like they were still warm from a printer. I didn't read them. I closed the folder and put it back. The mirror in the cabin had a hairline crack running across the bottom corner. It split my reflection just enough to look like 2 people standing close, but not touching. I left the lights off most nights. A single candle on the table was enough. The flame moved like it was listening. One morning, I folded a piece of paper into quarters and burned it in the sink. It wasn't a statement. It wasn't evidence. Just a grocery list from a life I no longer shopped for. I hadn't spoken out loud in 2 days. I didn't feel lonely. I didn't feel much of anything. And maybe that was the point. I wasn't here to heal. I wasn't here to forget. I was here to remember myself without interruption. It was quiet here. But it was mine. They didn't knock. They never had to. Their messages came dressed in politeness, but I'd learned to read the debt stitched beneath every word. Grayson's email subject line didn't blink. It just sat there. Need a quick favor. Family stuff. The kind of line you'd send to a coworker you only remember when your printer's jammed. I opened it anyway. The body of the message was neatly structured, as if copied from some donor outreach template. He used words like heritage legacy and shared pride. And then he folded it in. It would mean a lot if you joined us for a quick photo shoot. Just for the website. We're launching a fundraiser to preserve the Whitmore property. You're part of this, Cass, even if it's been complicated. Even if complicated. Words that sound like olive branches until you notice the thorns are pointing inward. I let the cursor hover over the closing line. Love always your brother. As if the digital ink could mask the last voicemail he left 2 years ago. We just can't keep covering for you anymore. On instinct, I reached for the old photo pinned beside the window frame, the one they'd edited. I hadn't noticed it at first, not until a friend pointed out that I was standing in the background, blurry and out of place. The photo was from a banquet I never attended. They'd spliced me in like a ghost, placed just behind Preston's right shoulder, looking the wrong way, as if I'd always been behind them. That same afternoon, my mother left a voicemail. Hi, sweetie, I know things got a little tense, but we'd love for you to be there next Sunday, just for the picture. You don't even have to say anything. She used the tone reserved for party RSVPs or dentist appointments, casual brief lacking any recognition that silence had grown roots between us. It's important that we look like a full family. You understand, right? The kettle clicked off behind me. I didn't move. I stared at the faint reflection of my face in the blackened screen, faint lines tracing along the eyes, not from battle or age, but from too many small moments that asked too little of others and too much of me. There was no mention of the investigation. No mention of the erased reports of the campaign they credited to someone else of the command I'd built that now carried someone else's nameplate. Only this show-up smile and make us whole again visually, if not truthfully. I pulled the printed email from the tray. The ink was still slightly warm. I folded it lengthwise like a formal invitation. Then again across the middle. 4 quadrants, easy to burn. The edges curled as I lit the bottom with a kitchen match and dropped it into the old cast-iron stove. The flame caught quickly. I didn't watch it all the way through. I just stood beside it until the last edge lifted and vanished through the chimney pipe like it had never been addressed to me at all. Later, Wes sent a single message, no greeting, no sign-off. They've already published the campaign preview. Grayson's listed as Lieutenant Colonel. Wasn't he discharged as captain? The cursor blinked. I typed 3 letters, yes, then erased them. My hands hovered, but no reply followed. I reached for the envelope that had arrived 2 weeks earlier, still unopened. Inside was a commemorative patch meant for past recipients of the Distinguished Service Cross. I didn't pin it anywhere, just slipped it into the drawer beside the cracked compass from field training and the faded sticky note that read, "Make it mean something." It didn't matter whether they believed I was family. Their need for my face in a frame didn't equate to making space for my voice in the room. They needed a symbol, not a sister. "Don't be dramatic," my mother once said when I told her I'd been placed under review for leaking documents I'd authored. "Just lie low. It'll pass." She had used the same tone when I told her I'd enlisted, the same when I told her I'd been promoted, the same when I told her I'd been cleared. It'll pass, as if my whole life was a storm she didn't want the neighbors to see. That evening, I didn't check my phone again. I poured water from the kettle into the same chipped mug I'd used every morning since leaving DC. The side still carried the faint outline of a White Sands emblem, rubbed half smooth by time and dish soap. I sat by the window. The light was softer now. I didn't count the hours since the message arrived, or the minutes since the fire took it. I didn't answer them. I didn't need to. Not answering is also a kind of reply. I used to believe I had to be translated to be understood. That if I wore the right uniform, filed the right report, offered the right tone, I could bridge the silence that always stretched too long between us. The chalk squeaked once before settling into a steady rhythm. 8 pairs of eyes followed the lines I drew, arrows that curved, stopped, diverged, but never quite looped back. I didn't name the operation. I didn't say when or where. I only described motion instinct and how sometimes the best plan isn't the one you write down, it's the one you feel. No one interrupted. They scribbled notes. Some nodded. One leaned forward. When I turned back to face them, I noticed the way the youngest, the one with the silver cross sewn into her sleeve, held her pen like it might snap. Her name tag read CPT Rourke. Her shoulders were drawn tight not from fear, but from holding something in too long. "Ma'am," she said quietly, after the others had stood to leave. "What do you do when the people above you pretend you don't exist?" I didn't answer right away. I placed the chalk on the windowsill, watching the dust settle along its edges. "You stop giving them the power to define what you're worth," I said. "That's when you start hearing yourself clearly." She didn't smile, but she didn't look down either. That was enough. I stayed behind to clean the board. No one asked me to. I liked the sound the eraser made soft and final, like folding a page you never intended to return to. The academy wasn't large, a few low buildings, most of them converted from older training facilities. The sign outside had Colleen Mercer's name on it, but the students never mentioned her. They just called it the place where people remember how to stand upright. Back at the cabin, the light outside had turned to that particular grey, where even shadows feel tired. I poured coffee into a chipped mug and didn't add cream this time. A line of steam curled past my knuckles, faint and steady. The watch lay untouched by the window. It had been reset once when I left Washington, but I hadn't wound it since. Sometimes I looked at it not for the time, but for the stillness. I reached for the manila envelope tucked beneath a stack of utility bills, inside the ID card, the laminated one that once gave me access to everything. I had traced the barcode once with my finger, not to remember, but to acknowledge it existed. Now I slid it into a plain envelope, sealed it without a note, and left it near the door. It didn't belong on the walls here. There was a rustle from outside, dry leaves, or maybe a footstep. I opened the door slowly, just air and the faint smell of cedar. The wind had tipped over the broom. I picked it up and leaned it back against the railing. No one there. I repainted the porch trim that afternoon, the brush moving slower as I neared the final panel. A nail had come loose. I pressed it in with the back of a screwdriver. The skin on my right thumb split a thin red line, appearing like punctuation. I wiped it with the corner of my sleeve and kept going. Colleen had mailed me a welcome package when I agreed to speak no contract, no expectations. Just a card. You are not a symbol. You are a person. Start from there. I'd kept it near the kitchen drawer beside a notepad where I jotted grocery lists and the occasional line that sounded like it mattered. One of them in uneven pen, they built their version of me. I left mine unfinished on purpose. The groceries I bought now came from a market 10 miles out. They never asked my name. Once a cashier commented on the scar above my collarbone. I told her it came from falling onto truth. She laughed. I didn't clarify. Later that evening, I folded laundry with the window open. The wind moved through the trees without disturbing anything. A single owl perched on the edge of the roof. It looked at me for a moment, head tilted, unreadable, then flew off. There was no metaphor to reach for, just the quiet after. The table near the stove had once held medals, certificates, letters with embossed seals. Now it held a jar of cloves, a dull knife, and a book on native trees of Missouri. The spine cracked whenever I opened it. I liked that sound too, like the beginning of something that didn't need an audience. I had painted a small wooden plank and nailed it beside the porch light. Whitmore no longer lives here. A joke, but not really. The mailman paused once while reading it. He didn't comment. That night, I built a small fire. Not because it was cold, but because it filled the space without requiring words. I watched the flames work their way through the last of the scrap wood from my porch repairs. I thought of Grayson's email again, not the words, but the spacing between them. How "we need you" took up more space than "we failed you." And how "you're still family" never quite came with a seat at the table. I didn't reply. I didn't save the message. Instead, I reached for the old suture kit, the one I kept for emergencies. I opened it, laid out the instruments, then closed it again, just making sure I still knew what healing looked like. The coffee had gone cold. I drank it anyway. And in that last moment before sleep, I didn't think of rank or legacy or headlines. I thought of the nail that had held through the storm, the one I hadn't replaced, the one that had bent but stayed in. I used to believe that some doors stayed open simply because we left quietly, that if I didn't slam them shut, they'd drift closed on their own. But some things need to be closed by hand. The key had rested in my coat pocket for years, curled slightly at the teeth, the edges worn smooth. I used to keep it on a ring with my first unit's locker tag. Eventually, it ended up alone, wrapped in a cotton handkerchief I never used. I brought it with me not because I wanted to go back, but because I needed to leave something behind. The drive to the Whitmore Ranch didn't feel like returning. I didn't take the main road. I cut through back routes I barely remembered. Gravel shoulders, rusted mailboxes, a school bus stop sign that no longer lit up. The closer I got, the smaller everything seemed. He was on the porch, not seated, just standing behind the screen, like he was waiting for a delivery. I parked by the cedar fence and walked up the path I used to sweep every fall. "Didn't think I'd see you here again," he said. I didn't respond. My steps were steady. The rocking chair was still there, splinters along the arm from where Grayson once carved his initials in secret, then blamed the dog when Dad noticed. I pulled the key from my pocket, unwrapped it slowly. It caught the light for a second, enough to notice the tiny curve where it had bent slightly over the time. I set it down on the wooden rail, not in his hand. "I don't live here," I said. "I never really did it." He looked at me like I'd spoken another language. From behind the screen door, Margaret hovered. Her hand rested on the edge of the frame, not quite opening it. She didn't say anything. Her mouth pressed into that familiar half-line I knew from years of carefully worded dismissals. "Don't make this into a scene," he said. "There is no scene," I replied. "Just a key that doesn't belong in my pocket anymore." I turned before the silence could be filled. The gravel under my boots didn't crunch like I expected, it just shifted, like even the ground didn't want to hold this weight. At the gas station 30 miles out, I parked beside an air pump that hadn't worked in years. I opened my laptop and logged into the government identity portal. Under the section labeled Legal Name Change, I typed Cassidy Boone. I didn't write a reason. There wasn't a box for that anyway. But if there had been, I might have said, "I am done carrying their name like a debt." I attached the scanned form and hit send. The screen flashed green. A confirmation email landed in my inbox seconds later. Request received. Processing within 7 to 10 business days. As if identity could be reissued like a license plate. The ride home was longer than it needed to be. I missed a turn on purpose, stopped at a roadside diner for coffee, and didn't drink it. On the back of the receipt, I drew a crooked arrow pointing north and wrote, "Keep going," even though I didn't need a reminder. At the cabin, the first thing I unpacked was the plaque. It had sat in a box marked MISC. For months, wedged between 2 paperbacks and an old compass. I wiped it with the sleeve of my sweatshirt, then mounted it on the wall above my desk. Soldier of the Year, Captain Cassidy Whitmore. The name stung a little, but not in protest. More like a scar that's lost its edge. I didn't hang it for pride. I hung it because that girl, the one who stood straight-backed in a borrowed uniform, boots polished with spit and sand, deserved to be remembered. She had believed that doing the right thing mattered, that truth didn't need permission, that dignity wasn't something a family gave or took, it was something you carried even when your hands were full of silence. The plaque didn't sit perfectly straight. One corner dipped half an inch lower than the other. I left it like that. On the way to bed, I paused by the kitchen window. The moon hung low over the ridge, thin as a thread, pulled too tight. I thought of Margaret behind that screen door, fingers resting just out of reach. I thought of my father's voice, still heavy with control, hollow with disappointment. But I also thought of the key, not just the one I left behind, but all the ones I've started forging without their permission. Some doors close quietly, others require the click of a lock to remind us that leaving was a decision, not an accident. I slept with the window cracked open that night. The wind moved through like it had somewhere to be. And for the first time in years, I didn't dream of home. I used to think I needed a witness, someone to stand quietly at the edge of my choices and say, yes, she lived. She made it through. Now I let the quiet do the remembering. The kettle hissed once, not quite boiling yet, and I left it alone. I pulled out the old ceramic mug, the one with the hairline crack circling its lip like a faded scar. The glaze had chipped at the handle. It never matched anything else in the cabin, which made it feel more mine. I ran my thumb along the rim, tracing the uneven line. There was a pile of mail on the table, some unopened, some opened and left, half read. I hadn't touched them in weeks, bills mostly. One envelope sat on top with the White House seal embossed in pale gold. I didn't open it. I moved it underneath a local flyer about seed exchange in town. I didn't throw it away either. I stirred the tea with the back end of a spoon. It left no sound, just soft ripples against porcelain. The steam caught in the light. Sometimes the smallest things prove that heat still lives in you. A cardinal landed on the edge of the window, just a flutter of red and weightlessness. Then it was gone. No note, left no reason given. The wooden floor groaned under my steps, but not in protest, just to let me know it was still beneath me. I stood in front of the bookshelf, letting my fingers pause on the folded army shirt, the one I had worn through 4 stations and 3 command rotations. The color had dulled. One of the buttons was missing. I didn't fold it sharply anymore. I laid it into the open-top box I'd made from pine slats and left it exposed. Not like a flag, not like a warning, more like an empty bowl left on the table after guests have gone. Just there. My notebook lay open beside it. The pencil had rolled off the binding. I picked it up and wrote one sentence with the tip, barely touching paper. Legacy isn't what they remember. It's what I choose to live without. I didn't press hard. I didn't need it to last. I remember the first time I truly tasted silence. It wasn't in combat, and it wasn't in disgrace. It was here when I realized no one was calling, not even to blame me. Silence used to feel like punishment. Now it feels earned. A faint knock came on the cabin door. No one used the bell. I opened it slightly. Ortiz stood with a pair of gloves slung through her belt loop and mud on her cheek, like she'd forgotten where she was and only remembered what needed doing. "Ms. Boone, my friend wanted to know, can she borrow your copy of Marcus Aurelius?" I nodded once. "Tell her not to return it. Just pass it on when she's done." Ortiz smiled and ran off. "No salute, no ma'am. Just a girl with dirt under her nails and purpose in her step." I closed the door slowly. Let the wood meet wood, without protest. There were more letters I would never send. One sat in my drawer, unfinished. "Dad, you once told me duty means disappearing when it's convenient for the greater good." But I learned that disappearing doesn't always mean serving. I stopped writing after that. There wasn't a need to finish. Mom had once texted me after the tribunal when the suspension went public. "It's time to be quiet, Cassidy. The family has suffered enough." I stared at it for days, then deleted it. Not in anger, just like wiping down a counter, removing what no longer belonged. I had changed my name legally 2 weeks ago. Boone, my grandmother's maiden name. She grew up in a brick house in Franklin County and made her own soap in a steel pot. She once told me, "Never tie your name to a man who thinks his is heavier." I hadn't known what that meant then. Now I did. The cabin didn't have a television. Sometimes I heard the crackle of static on the old radio by accident when the dial bumped loose. I didn't fix it. I taught 2 days a week now, small tactical workshops for veterans who were done proving themselves. We never wore uniforms. One of the women Lee brought a homemade compass once and said it always pointed west. It didn't matter if it was true. It just mattered that she believed it would. I walked outside later, boots slipping slightly on wet pine needles. The plot behind the cabin was marked with small stakes and string where the others were helping plant tomatoes and squash. No one asked if I owned the land. No one questioned why I stayed. Someone had left a worn copy of The Things They Carried on the porch bench. No note, just placed there, spine up like an offering. I flipped to a page at random and read one line out loud without realizing it. They carried the sky. I placed the book and qatad. I didn't mark the page. A storm had passed 2 nights ago. I found part of a fallen branch curled under the back step, like it had sheltered there on purpose. I left it. I made tea again in the afternoon. Same cup. I added more sugar this time. Let it sit longer. No rush. No mission clock. I thought about the phrase someone once told me, "You owe the world your usefulness." No. I owe the world nothing that costs me myself. There's a logbook by the door where visitors sometimes scribble things. One line today read, "Cassidy, thank you for reminding us that we're allowed to stop fighting." It wasn't signed. I touched the old medal once as I passed the wall. Just lightly. Just enough to know it hadn't vanished. Evening came slow. I folded a clean dishcloth, set it beside the sink. Water droplets clung to the rim of the pot I hadn't dried yet. I didn't turn on a single light. I let the dark come in the way it always had, without knocking, without apology. I sat with it. And for the first time, it didn't sit heavier than me.